Ferdinand VII entered the world not as a symbol of hope, but as a grotesque byproduct of centuries-long dynastic decay. Born on October 14, 1784, at El Escorial Palace, his existence was the culmination of a royal breeding program more concerned with preserving bloodlines than humanity. The Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons had fused their veins with cousins, nieces, and uncles for generations, creating a lineage so corrupted that even nature recoiled. Where once kings had emerged with the illusion of divine right, Ferdinand arrived, twisted not just in mind, but in flesh. From the moment of his birth, he was marked. His body was examined with the nervous reverence of priests inspecting a relic that might be cursed. Midwives exchanged terrified glances. The infant prince's anatomy, especially the malformed, oversized genitalia that would become his legacy, defied comprehension. It was not merely large, it was unnatural, distorted in ways that unsettled even the palace physicians. They wrote no public declarations, only veiled notes in secret ledgers. In official portraits, the infant appeared serene, but beneath the silks, hidden behind swaddling and shame, was a grotesque signal of what the monarchy had become. Bloated, malformed, and barely able to function, the court whispered, nurses gossiped in hushed tones, foreign dignitaries heard strange rumors and sent coded messages to their home courts. The boy is unwell, some wrote, not in the mind, but in that which defines a man. Ferdinand's parents, Charles IV and Maria Louisa of Parma, themselves cousins, were too politically entangled and too spiritually exhausted to see the child for what he was. His father, weak-willed and docile, preferred hunting and clockmaking to parenting. His mother, vain and manipulative, dismissed his deformities as divine eccentricities. No one dared speak plainly. To do so would be to admit that centuries of incest had birthed a living indictment of royal arrogance. Ferdinand grew in silence and isolation. His earliest years were defined by a cruel dichotomy: absolute privilege and total alienation. He had golden toys, but no friends. He dined beneath chandeliers, but sat alone. The servants, instructed to obey, could not help but recoil in private. Children of the nobility avoided him. Tutors treated him delicately, as if harsh words might shatter his already brittle self-worth. And all the while he became aware of it, the thing between his legs, the aberration that whispered to him in the dark and made him feel monstrous in his own skin. He hated mirrors. He hated baths. He hated the physician's cold instruments and the court's pitying smiles. The palace became a maze of eyes, watching, judging, laughing, just out of earshot. He learned to detect mockery in every tone, to see insult in every gesture. What others would shrug off as polite formality, Ferdinand interpreted as humiliation. His deformity was not simply physical, it had become the nucleus around which his entire psyche revolved. There were early attempts to correct it, secret consultations with foreign doctors, herbalists, even traveling mystics who promised to balance his bodily humors. Nothing helped. One concoction caused a fever, another made him hallucinate, a third triggered painful swelling that left him bedridden for days. Every failure further cemented the belief that he was cursed. But curses, he began to think, could be reversed not through healing, but through power. If his body made him a freak, his crown would make him a god. What should have humbled him instead cultivated hatred. As he grew, he began to study those who mocked him, learning their habits, memorizing their faces. He fantasized not about love or legacy, but about vengeance. His journals, now lost to time but referenced in hidden ecclesiastical documents, purportedly contained pages filled with the names of courtiers who had laughed, servants who had stared, and tutors who had dared correct him. He would not forgive, he would not forget. The deformity became doctrine. Ferdinand began to believe he was chosen not by God, but by a crueler, more ancient force. Why else would he be made this way? Why else would nature forge such a weapon, and give it to a prince? If he could not be loved, he would be feared. If he could not be normal, he would be worshipped for his abnormalities. This logic, twisted and festering, took root deep inside him, poisoning every relationship he would ever form. The young boy who might have been pitied became a man who demanded obedience, even as he feared exposure. By adolescence, the damage was irreversible. His perception of the world had been warped by years of silent ridicule and visible disgust. No one had touched him with affection. No one had spoken to him without calculation. Power was no longer a tool, it was a shield, a mirror, and a whip. And he would use it to carve respect from a world that had mocked him since birth. Thus began the transformation of Ferdinand VII, not into a ruler but into a tyrant molded by shame. His anatomy had made him a monster in the mirror. His dynasty had made him believe monsters deserved thrones. Together they would destroy everything that touched them. By the time Ferdinand entered adolescence, his secret had become too large, too misshapen, too grotesque to contain within the fragile veil of royal dignity. The efforts to suppress awareness of his anatomical curse intensified, but so did the whispers. Physicians, sworn to secrecy and bribed into silence, began to document his condition in cryptic Latin, concealed in volumes locked behind iron doors within the palace apothecary's forbidden wing. They described an appendage whose shape defied human architecture, narrow at the base, monstrous at the tip, like a weapon designed by a deranged mind. They debated whether it was the product of hormonal imbalance, malformed tissue, or divine retribution. What they agreed upon was more damning than diagnosis. It was unfit for function and unworthy of its royal bearer. Tailors were instructed to design elaborate undergarments reinforced with leather padding and silk sashes to disguise the abnormality. Cushions were discreetly sewn into court uniforms. Bathing was arranged only under strict supervision. Mirrors were draped. Every public appearance required meticulous planning to hide what could not be corrected. Yet the court, like all courts, thrived on rumor and rot. The more the royal household tried to smother the secret, the more it grew in myth. A malformed prince with a beast's appendage became the whispered entertainment of courtiers who had nothing left to believe in. Foreign envoys wrote in code to their governments. The heir is of unusual configuration, one Prussian diplomat wrote. Another, less diplomatic, referred to Ferdinand as the Spanish Minotaur. Private letters passed through the embassies described a boy with the curse of Jupiter and the heart of a frightened lamb. These missives spread through diplomatic circles like a contagion, staining Ferdinand's name long before he would sit on a throne. Every handshake, every nod, every bow he received at court was now suspect. Was it respect or a charade meant to veil disgust? The humiliation embedded itself in his psyche like a worm. It wasn't only that he was mocked, it was that he could never be sure who was mocking him. Silence became its own form of cruelty. Smiles became daggers. Every glance was a potential insult. Every cough a stifled laugh. And worst of all, there was no escape. His body, the inescapable source of his shame, followed him into every room, every conversation, every dream. It governed him like a monarch far more cruel than his father. By 15, Ferdinand had ceased trusting anyone. He spoke less, observed more. He began keeping notebooks, small leather-bound volumes filled with names, incidents, imagined slights. He catalogued betrayals, both real and imagined. Servants were rotated weekly. Tutors were dismissed for improper posture. One boy who accidentally saw Ferdinand disrobing during a wardrobe fitting was sent away in disgrace, his entire family exiled without explanation. The royal guards referred to the event as El Silencio del Page, the silence of the pager, cautionary tale of what happens to those who see too much. In private, Ferdinand's thoughts turned darker. He began to interpret his condition through the lens of religion and mysticism. Was he cursed for the sins of his ancestors, or chosen as a symbol of God's wrath upon Spain? He began reading forbidden theological texts, medieval and writings on bodily anomalies, seeking meaning in deformity. He started believing that his affliction had a purpose, not a punishment, but a sign. He was meant to be feared, not pitied, revered, not corrected. The grotesque was not a fly, it was a crown. This belief became armor, and beneath it, Ferdinand began forging a new identity, not as a victim of birth, but as a sovereign sculpted. By suffering, his shame became his justification. If the world mocked him, he would mock it back. If they feared his body, they would soon fear his rule. His deformity was no longer an obstacle, it was his divine right to cruelty. The inner rot spread outward. Ferdinand grew increasingly fascinated with power, not governance, but dominance. He watched how servants flinched, how ministers hesitated in his presence, and he drank their discomfort like wine. He began testing boundaries, issuing contradictory orders, forcing courtiers to choose between public humiliation or private punishment. Each incident fed a festering appetite to control what he could not fix. His body betrayed him, but his status did not, and he would wield it like a blade. The court, sensing this shift, responded with obedience tinged with dread. Ferdinand's presence darkened rooms. His silence filled halls. The prince no longer needed to be mocked. He had become the mockery itself, a living reminder of what happened when privilege defied nature. And as the deformity below his waist grew into a monstrosity, so too did the deformity within his mind. The anatomy that had once evoked horror had evolved into something far more dangerous, a justification for tyranny. It no longer mattered whether Ferdinand could consummate a marriage or sire an heir. What mattered was that he had suffered, and in his suffering he had learned to see other people not as equals or even subordinates, but as threats, as insects, to be crushed beneath a crown forged from decades of whispered shame. In that transformation, from mocked child to vengeful prince, the true horror of Ferdinand's reign was born. Not in the flesh that cursed him, but in the mind it mutilated. In 1802, the Spanish court prepared for a union it believed would secure the monarchy's future. Ferdinand, still a prince, but already a festering symbol of a rotting lineage, was to marry Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, his first cousin and a girl of only 17. The match was born from dynastic necessity, not affection. To the diplomats it was a union of bloodlines. To Ferdinand it was a desperate attempt to validate his manhood. To Maria Antonia it would become a descent into unspeakable trauma. Cloaked in the rituals of royal matrimony, Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid with illusions crafted by portraiture and poetry. She had been told her husband was El Deseado, the desired one. She imagined a man of strength, intellect, and nobility. But on their wedding night, those illusions collapsed into hysteria. When Ferdinand revealed himself, her scream pierced the palace walls. What she beheld was not a man, but a grotesque medical anomaly, an appendage, so massive and misshapen that it resembled a disfigured club more than any instrument of intimacy. The reaction was instinctive and primal. She recoiled in terror, screamed monster, and fell into convulsions. That moment would define the remainder of her short, tortured life. The marriage was not consummated in the traditional sense. It was orchestrated, medicalized, sterilized, and scheduled like an operation. Physicians were summoned, oils prepared, and specially crafted cushions positioned to prevent internal injury. What unfolded was not lovemaking, but procedure. Maria Antonia was dosed with increasing quantities of laudanum to dull the physical pain and suppress her mounting psychological anguish. Even sedated, her body tensed at his approach. She wept afterward, silently, while the physicians recorded details of positioning and outcome. Like surgeons assessing a failed experiment, each attempt at procreation became a ritual of dread. Ferdinand, obsessed with producing an heir, treated his wife not as a partner but as a vessel. When months passed without pregnancy, his frustration turned to blame. He accused her of resisting him in subtle ways, of sabotaging conception through body language, through movement, through thoughts. His paranoia deepened. He suspected her of harboring liberal sympathies, of being influenced by foreign enemies, of poisoning her womb with silent rebellion. Maria Antonia, once vibrant and intellectually curious, began to fade. Her ladies-in-waiting watched her descend into dependency and silence. She clutched prayer beads with shaking hands and whispered apologies for sins she could not name. She grew thinner, paler, more spectral with each passing month. Her laughter vanished, her appetite dwindled. Her letters, home turned cryptic and hollow. And still, Ferdinand persisted, summoning physicians, experimenting with astrological charts, commissioning new devices to aid in the act that had become more torture than union. She miscarried twice, the first and the fourth month, after an especially violent encounter that left her bedridden and bleeding for days. The second, almost a full term, destroyed what little remained of her will to survive. The court physicians recorded complications and constitutional frailty, but the truth was etched in her hollow eyes. Her body had simply rejected the burden of carrying a legacy forged in agony. Ferdinand responded not with grief, but with suspicion. He interrogated her physicians. He demanded her food be tested. He ordered autopsies on her unborn children. When he looked at his wife, he no longer saw a companion or even a failed queen. He saw an adversary, someone conspiring against his destiny. His demands became more frequent, his touches more violent. Restraints were introduced under the guise of medical necessity. Maria Antonia, doped and bound, endured what can only be described as state-sanctioned violation over and over again, in pursuit of a child that would never come. By 1807, at just 21 years old, Maria Antonia was dead. The official cause was listed as fever and complications from her delicate constitution. But her death was not sudden. It was a long, drawn-out collapse into despair. Laudanum addiction, trauma-induced psychosis, and possibly even poison. These were the more truthful contributors. Whispers circulated that Ferdinand had grown tired of her failures and had sought to replace her with a more fruitful wife. The palace apothecary who prepared her medicines was found dead days after her passing. His suicide note confiscated and never seen again. In her final weeks, Maria Antonia reportedly spoke to walls, clutched crucifixes until her hands bled, and cried out to the Virgin Mary to undo her womb. She died not just in isolation, but in absolute hopelessness, the victim of a marriage that had been less about love or even politics, and more about anatomical vengeance. Her body, so young and once so full of promise, had become a battlefield. For a man's pathological legacy, Ferdinand made the expected displays of mourning. He ordered black tapestries, wept theatrically before the court, and issued official proclamations of grief. But in private, he began making inquiries about remarriage within weeks. Maria Antonia's belongings were removed swiftly. Her name was spoken less and less, her portrait taken down, her memory eroded by the very institution that had consumed her. Her death left behind more than an empty bedchamber. It established a precedent that queens could be broken, their suffering masked by velvet and incense. Ferdinand's deformity was no longer just a secret, it was a contagion, infecting everyone forced to lie beneath him, and his obsession with proving his manhood, far from ending, had only just begun. Maria Antonia's death was not a tragedy for Ferdinand, it was a liberation. No longer bound by the theater of affection or the fragile needs of a woman who screamed at his touch. He emerged from mourning not with remorse, but with resolve. Her demise confirmed what he had long suspected, that love was an impediment, tenderness a weakness, and emotional reciprocity a distraction from the higher duty of legacy. The heir had not come through compassion. It would come, he now believed, through conquest of bodies, of biology, of will. He transformed the palace from a royal court into a sanctum of experimentation. The same artisans who once embroidered royal banners were now enlisted to design implements of anatomical accommodation. Blacksmiths were directed to shape iron supports, tailors instructed to reinforce bedding, and apothecaries to formulate sedatives calibrated to subdue but not silence. What was once called the marital chamber became a laboratory, a grotesque fusion of medical necessity and sexual pathology. Everything was calculated to serve a single function, to force a woman's body to cooperate with a man whose own form defied nature. Doctors were no longer healers, they became engineers. He demanded schematics of the female reproductive tract. He obsessed over measurements, angles, and tissue thresholds. When one physician proposed minor surgical intervention, Ferdinand had him exiled for lack of faith. Faith, not medicine, had become the standard by which obedience was judged. Faith in the possibility that his curse could be converted into triumph. Faith that a woman would not shatter beneath him. Faith that God, having mocked him in form, might yet reward his persistence with fruit. He brought mystics to court, astrologers, blood charmers, monks turned heretics who promised results through celestial alignments and sacred geometry. One offered the theory that his deformity was a sacred relic, a divine staff requiring only the correct ritual to unlock its fertility. Another claimed that consuming powdered bones of saints might alter the course of conception. Ferdinand listened, nodded, paid handsomely, and tried everything. The palace kitchens reeked of crushed antlers, powdered pearls, and aphrodisiacal tinctures so volatile they had to be stored behind lead doors. Every new mixture brought hope. Every failure deepened his obsession. Servants were made to swear oaths of secrecy under threat of torture. Those who saw too much a glance in the corridor, a misstep in the dressing room, disappeared. Their names were erased from the registers. Their families were given pensions and silence. It became understood that to survive in Ferdinand's court was to see nothing, hear nothing, question nothing. Women were chosen for pliability, not pedigree. Noble birth mattered less than psychological malleability. He sought docile temperaments, quiet voices, and a history of compliance. Virginity was not a virtue, it was a liability. He preferred widows or those who had previously borne children, believing their bodies had proven capable and their spirits already broken. These women were subjected to private interviews in the presence of physicians and priests. They were measured in inches and in fear. Those who flinched, hesitated, or wept were dismissed. Those who complied were caged in gold and draped in titles. Marriage ceased to be a contract. It became a clinical trial. Ferdinand treated each wife, not as a partner but as an experiment. He recorded observations after each encounter. Duration, swelling, blood, noise, resistance. His journals, sealed after his death, read less like royal memoirs and more like the notes of a deranged anatomist. He graded the performance of his wives with the same detachment used to evaluate livestock. The crown no longer rested on his head. It had moved lower to the thing he believed defined him. His rule was an extension of his anatomy, his policies shaped by his pathology. Ministers reported to him while the stench of ointments clung to his clothes. Decrees were signed between failed couplings. Spain was ruled from a bed that no longer symbolized succession, but domination. His paranoia, once a hum beneath the surface, became a permanent roar. He believed foreign courts were mocking his condition. He suspected his wives of reporting his failures to their home countries. Letters were intercepted. Rooms were searched for hidden ink and false walls. One queen was forbidden from writing in her native language. Another had her personal confessor replaced by a man loyal only to Ferdinand. Even physicians were monitored, their diagnoses vetted not for truth, but for flattery. One was imprisoned for describing Ferdinand's condition as medically extraordinary. The king wanted it called divine. The palace lived under a cloud of permanent anxiety. Laughter became rare. Smiles were calculated. Every member of the court understood they lived not under the rule of a king, but under the shadow of a man at war with his own body. His deformity was not a secret anymore. It had become a climate, permeating every decision, every policy, every breath within the royal halls. The cruelty was not merely physical, it was spiritual, psychological, omnipresent. He weaponized his suffering, using it to justify acts that, in any other man, would have been called madness. But in Ferdinand, they were labeled necessity. Spain needed an heir. Spain needed continuity. Spain needed his curse to become its salvation. What emerged in the wake of Maria Antonia's death was not a grieving widower. It was a ruler who had unshackled himself from empathy. His deformity was no longer a burden, it was an excuse, a reason to reshape the world in his own twisted image. And behind every law, every appointment, every bed prepared for royal coupling, was the same monstrous truth, that Ferdinand VII did not rule Spain, his affliction did. Maria Isabel of Portugal was just 19 when she entered the Spanish court in 1816. Carrying nothing but political expectation and the doomed hope of pleasing a man no one dared to describe honestly. What awaited her beyond the gold corridors was not royalty, but ruin. Her wedding night was not the consummation of a sacred union, but an assault orchestrated beneath chandeliers and sacred vows. Despite all the preparations, cushions, sedatives, physicians on standby, sheer physical horror of Ferdinand's anatomy broke her. Servants later recounted screams so piercing they silenced an entire wing of the palace. The next morning, the queen could not speak. By the end of the month she had developed a stutter that would plague her until death. The trauma embedded itself, not only in her mind, but in her posture, her gait, her breath. She flinched at the rustle of his robes. She recoiled at the smell of the tinctures he applied to his grotesque flesh. The palace physicians noted hysterical episodes, but what unfolded was the inevitable collapse of a woman forced to bear the weight of someone else's unspeakable shame. Her nights were filled with fear, her days with pretense. She aged rapidly, her body hollowed by laudanum and dread. When she finally died 2 years later, the official cause was listed as nervous exhaustion, but those who attended her last weeks whispered of spontaneous bleeding, hallucinations, and whispered prayers begging for release from her marital duties. Maria Josepha of Saxony arrived in 1819 with a different approach. She had been warned. Her family had extracted written guarantees. She brought her own physician, her own set of remedies, her own resignation. Where Maria Isabel had been hopeful and innocent, Maria Josepha was clinical and cold. She documented every procedure like a scientist. Every failed attempt at intimacy was recorded, categorized, measured, the time of day, the positioning, the after. She tolerated the process with mechanical precision, treating her husband less as a partner and more as a medical anomaly. But even cold logic could not shield her from what she endured. The instruments became more sophisticated, more elaborate. The royal craftsman, now well versed in the architecture of restraint and lubrication, produced devices that resembled surgical machinery more than marital aids. Sessions were timed, drugs administered in carefully titrated doses. After each ordeal, Maria Josepha would retire to her chambers and write her notes. She rarely cried, she never protested, but her silence was not strengthened with surrender. She slowly withered, her body rejecting nourishment, her mind turning inward. Witnesses described her as walking in a trance, her voice barely above a whisper, her presence ghost-like. When she finally conceived, the miracle was short-lived. Complications arose. Blood seeped through the silken sheets before the 7th month. The child, delivered too early, died within hours. Maria Josepha died 3 weeks later, her body riddled with infection and despair, while his wives perished in quiet agony. Ferdinand continued to commission devices and consult mystics. He sought advice from Turkish eunuchs, Hindu tantrics, and German anatomists. Some came with promises of virility, others with diagrams of sexual acrobatics meant to compensate for his abnormality. He tried them all, and when they failed, he blamed the women too fragile, too cold, too cursed. His court had become a rotating gallery of female sacrifice, each one devoured by the machinery of legacy. Outside the palace walls, Spain was imploding. The American colonies revolted one by one, severing ties with the dying empire. The economy collapsed under mismanagement and neglect. Foreign powers mocked the court's obsessive fixation on fertility while its people starved. Revolution brewed in the streets, but Ferdinand remained imprisoned within his own walls, oblivious to the world decaying beyond his chambers. His kingdom burned, and he counted sperm motility. His cities rebelled, and he compared sketches of his wives' cervixes. The throne, once a symbol of divine right, had become a grotesque altar to personal shame. Every proclamation issued was tinged with delusion. Every decree served the fantasy that his seed could still redeem a nation. Ministers resigned, generals deserted, but the palace remained trapped in its own gravitational pull around the singular truth that the king's body, malformed and unresolved, dictated the fate of millions. His court became a theater of control. Servants rotated weekly to prevent gossip. Physicians swore blood oaths. Midwives were paid and threatened in equal measure. Nothing entered or left the queen's chambers without scrutiny. The mattresses were measured for blood, the chamber pots examined for signs of pregnancy. Even the air seemed heavy with failure. Hope, once a flicker, had become a superstition. No one dared speak aloud. Ferdinand's dysfunction was no longer personal. It had metastasized. His wives were not victims of biology, they were casualties of empire. The marriages were not failures of intimacy, they were state-sponsored acts of psychological torture. The monarchy itself had become a mechanism of denial, powered by delusion and lubricated by blood. By the time Maria Josepha died, Ferdinand no longer mourned. He calculated, he revised timelines, he sought new candidates. The throne demanded continuity, and he would not allow biology to defeat him, not publicly, not ceremonially. And so the cycle would continue. New wife, new instruments, new horrors. His body, unfixable and grotesque, had reshaped not only his life, but the entire structure of his nation. Spain, like its king, was disfigured, humiliated, and bleeding, internally, and beneath the crown, beneath the velvet robes and incense and prayers, was nothing more than a man whose broken flesh dictated a country's destiny. Maria Cristina of Naples entered the Spanish court under a veil of quiet scandal, her body already bearing the consequence of another man's passion. In any other royal house, this would have been a catastrophe, but for Ferdinand it was opportune, humiliating, and seductive in its deceit. He knew, everyone knew, the timing was impossible to deny. The child growing in her womb could not be his. Yet, in the hollow halls of a monarchy rotting from within, denial became doctrine. Ferdinand proclaimed it a miracle. He cited divine providence. He pointed to visions, dreams, omens in birds and stars. He declared that God had, at last, blessed him through unconventional means. The truth, however, gnawed at him like a festering wound. Every physician who attended the queen was interrogated. Every midwife cross-examined. Her diet was modified, her movement monitored, her interactions policed. The child might not be of his flesh, but it would be born under his rule, and for Ferdinand, control was the last illusion he could still maintain. Maria Christina's chambers became a prison draped in satin. She was never alone. Servants lingered at her door not to serve, but to report. Her meals were tasted 3 times, not for poison, but for purity, each ingredient traced, timed, and logged. The linens she slept on were weighed and checked for stains. Her body was no longer hers. It belonged to the machinery of Ferdinand's fantasy. Every breath she took was considered either compliance or conspiracy. He drilled peepholes into the walls between their chambers, watching her from behind hidden slats like a deranged sentinel. He monitored the tone of her voice during prayer, the way she held the rosary, the frequency of her sighs. She was not a wife. She was a specimen, a sacred vessel under surveillance. Midnight inspections became routine. Ferdinand, wrapped in silk and suspicion, would burst into her chamber unannounced, demanding to see the swell of her belly, insisting on confirmation that the child was progressing as expected. His paranoia was no longer private, it was institutionalized. When Isabella was born in 1830, the palace erupted in celebration. Bells rang, emissaries wept, and Spain rejoiced. An heir had been delivered, a girl, but a symbol of continuity nonetheless. To the people, she was a blessing. To Ferdinand, she was a paradox. He held her in his arms, stared into her face, and searched obsessively for traces of himself, his eyes, his nose, his cursed bloodline. But all he saw was failure wearing a crown. He hired painters to capture the child's face at various stages of infancy, then commissioned forgeries of his own childhood portraits to compare them. The resemblance was fabricated, painted into existence, curated like propaganda. He forced physicians to record her growth against false developmental milestones that matched his own. He brought in genealogists, men of science, turned liars to draft papers suggesting obscure bloodlines that could plausibly tie Maria Christina's pregnancy back to him. Every detail was rewritten, every doubt silenced. The cost of maintaining the illusion was monstrous. Ministers who questioned the child's legitimacy found themselves reassigned to colonial outposts or placed under investigation for treason. Priests were ordered to preach about miracles in their sermons. Scholars were paid to write pamphlets about unusual conceptions in royal history. The lie became national policy. It entered textbooks, prayer books, treaties. But Maria Christina bore the heaviest weight. The joy of motherhood, already corrupted by fear, became unbearable under Ferdinand's gaze. He did not see her as the mother of his child, but as the architect of his shame. He scrutinized her interactions with Isabella, monitoring her tone, her warmth, her expressions. He demanded reports from nurses on whether the queen favored the child too obviously, as if her affection proved guilt. His obsession with secrecy mutated into ritual. Every visitor to the nursery was vetted, every toy inspected, every lullaby transcribed. Ferdinand believed that betrayal could be smuggled in through even the most innocent objects. He began planting servants in the queen's entourage, instructing them to ask leading questions, to test her reactions, to report whether she ever slipped, ever hinted at the true parentage of the child. The king's fixation extended into theology. He summoned bishops and asked whether divine conception could occur without direct physical union. He demanded written assurances that miracles were not bound by biology. When one cleric hesitated, quoting canon law, Ferdinand had him removed from his post and replaced with a more agreeable theologian. Truth was malleable. It bent under the weight of a king's desperation. The irony was suffocating. The child who should have been his redemption became his torment. Isabella embodied everything he had failed to produce: life, legacy, and the illusion of normalcy. But her existence reminded him, every moment, of his unfixable condition. He oscillated between adoration and revulsion, kissing her forehead in public, then interrogating nurses in private about her sleeping patterns, her features, her temperament. He feared her laughter, convinced it echoed the voice of a stranger. Maria Christina, battered by years of surveillance and manipulation, began to deteriorate. Her letters to family became cryptic and despairing. She wrote of shadows that moved even when no one walked, of feeling watched through mirrors, of meals delayed until the king's spies had finished their silent inspections. Her hair began to fall. Her hands shook. Her eyes, once lively, dulled into a permanent stare of quiet suffering. Isabella, too, inherited more than a throne. She inherited a palace haunted by her father's lies. Her earliest memories were shaped by restriction, her caretakers terrified of missteps, her mother emotionally absent, consumed by caution. She was the product of a fiction so carefully maintained that no one dared speak her name without rehearsing the narrative. Even her lullabies were censored. Ferdinand's greatest political achievement, producing an heir, was also his most devastating personal failure. He had built an empire of deception, with a child as its crown jewel, and in doing so he etched into the very foundation of Spain a lie so deep, so corrosive, that its reverberations would echo through generations. Isabella was born not into monarchy, but into madness, and that madness wore the face of a father who could never be what he claimed, and a legacy built on the denial of truth. Ferdinand's descent was not sudden. It unfolded like a slow strangulation, quiet at first, then suffocating, until every corner of the royal palace gasped under the pressure of his madness. By the last decade of his reign, the monarchy had become a theater of fear. What had begun as humiliation buried in flesh had risen, monstrous and unchecked, into a style of rule defined entirely by suspicion, delusion, and the unrelenting search for enemies. He no longer governed, he investigated. The palace was gutted and retrofitted into a labyrinth of control. Hidden doors, false walls, spy holes bored into stone. The walls themselves seemed to listen, to betray. Servants were rotated weekly to prevent collusion. Ministers were subjected to daily loyalty tests, so absurd they resembled children's games laced with knives. One was asked to rearrange a bouquet, gifted to the Queen when he chose lilies over carnations. Ferdinand accused him of signaling support for foreign Protestant agents. Another brought him a birthday book of psalms bound in red leather. The king saw not devotion but danger. The crimson cover, he insisted, was a warning from liberal radicals. The minister was dismissed, his home ransacked, his children interrogated. Silence became currency, expression, a liability. Courtiers began whispering in invented codes, avoiding eye contact, communicating through gestures refined over years of training in smiles were rehearsed, pauses timed. A laugh in the wrong hallway could be interpreted as mockery. A glance at the Queen might suggest lust or espionage. Nothing was safe. Everything meant something. And Ferdinand interpreted it all through the cracked lens of a man whose internal world had completely decoupled from reality. Even the meals became rituals of suspicion. Food tasters no longer sampled for poison alone. They waited, trembling, under the king's eye, holding each mouthful for precisely the time it would take a slow toxin to show effect. 30 minutes, no more, no less. One taster's hand shook. As he swallowed the king's porridge, the tremor was interpreted as treason. He disappeared by morning. Ferdinand began insisting on 2 tasters per dish, then 3, then rotating teams to prevent collusion. Meals delayed for hours. Nutrition degraded into paranoia. He withered, thin and twitching, convinced that death stalked his plate. His marriage to Maria Cristina dissolved under this pressure. What had begun as a lie of convenience now became an inquisition. He searched her letters for secret codes. He interrogated her confessors, asking whether she wept in the wrong way, knelt for too long, touched the cross too slowly. He accused her of training Isabella to betray him. Once he claimed her prayers were performed at unnatural times, aligning with dark lunar cycles that hinted at witchcraft. The Queen, barely clinging to sanity, learned to move with precision, never too quickly, never too still. She became a living statue, adapting to the climate of fear that surrounded her. Isabella fared no better. Though still a child, she had already become the object of her father's most dangerous delusions. He stared into her face with unbearable intensity, searching for traces of his own features, a curl of the lip, a tilt of the nose, the shape of her fingers. When he couldn't find them, he turned on her nurses. He accused them of coaching her to mimic other men, of dressing her in colors that symbolized betrayal, of grooming her to be the child of his enemies. One nurse, aged only 24, was found dead in the royal gardens, her mouth stuffed with cloth. Official reports declared suicide. Her colleagues knew better. The throne room, once a place of ceremony, became a chamber of surveillance. Ferdinand installed mirrors at strategic angles, allowing him to monitor every reflection. He kept detailed logs of who stood where, who bowed too deeply, who dared to look up. Ministers were forced to contradict him in private to test their loyalty. Those who agreed too quickly were suspect, those who hesitated, traitors. Every meeting was a test, every interaction a trap. His paranoia wasn't hidden, it became state policy. Spain no longer had laws. It had interpretations, and those interpretations changed with every pulse of the king's fear. Foreign diplomats watched in disbelief. Reports sent back to Vienna, London, and Paris no longer read like political briefings. They were diaries of dysfunction. Mentions of ritualized food tasting, secret passages, forced prayers, and nighttime inspections filled the pages. European courts began distancing themselves. Alliances faltered. Trade slowed. Spain became a cautionary tale, a once mighty empire reduced to a paranoid man watching his daughter sleep through a hole in the wall. The institutions of state rotted. The Council of Ministers was replaced by a revolving door of yes-men. The clergy, once loyal, began whispering dissent behind cathedral walls. The military grew restless. Colonies, already on fire with rebellion, seized on the chaos. South America burned while Ferdinand counted the number of times his wife crossed herself before bed. The church bells that once rang for the glory of the crown now tolled for provinces lost, lives ruined. A country devouring itself from the top down. In his final years, Ferdinand lost all coherence. His speeches became rants, fragmented, fevered, dripping with invented conspiracies. He referenced plots that no one had heard of, accused children of sedition, and once demanded the execution of a cabinet minister for blinking too frequently. Physicians described a man suffering from nervous agitation, a term far too delicate for the reality. His mind had decayed into a stew of shame, delusion, and bile. The palace no longer served the people. It served the paranoia of a single man, a man broken not by politics or war, but by his own body. What began as a private affliction had metastasized into a national cancer. His shame had not stayed hidden beneath silk sheets or whispered. Behind closed doors, it had risen through his voice, poured into his decrees, shaped his diplomacy, and infected every institution that still clung to the corpse of Spain's imperial identity. Ferdinand did not rule. He clung to his throne, to his lies, to the child who bore another man's blood, to the illusion that somewhere in the chaos, there was still dignity left to reclaim. But there wasn't. His kingdom was gone, his legacy, a cautionary tale, his paranoia, the architect of national ruin, and as Spain collapsed under the weight of his madness, Ferdinand sat alone in a palace filled with mirrors, watching reflections that no longer obeyed. When Ferdinand VII died in 1833, there were no victories to record, no reforms to commemorate, no nation restored by his reign. What he left behind was not a legacy, but wreckage, a kingdom stripped of its colonies, a monarchy tainted by madness, a palace haunted by women who had withered under his touch, and at the center of it all, the body that had dictated every policy, consumed every marriage, and sculpted an entire generation of Spanish history through its grotesque presence. It was not his mind nor his crown that defined him. It was the deformity and the desperate, secret war he waged against it. Upon his death, the physicians gathered in silence. The official cause was listed as gout, a diplomatic term for a man destroyed by stress and systemic failure. But behind locked doors, in a sealed chamber known only to a few, the final chapter unfolded. An autopsy was performed not for justice, but for understanding. For centuries, speculation had clung to Ferdinand like a second skin. Now the flesh would answer. What they found horrified even the most experienced among them. His body bore the scars of a life lived in anatomical torment. The organ, long whispered about in diplomatic corridors and scrawled in marginalia of Vatican correspondences, was real and worse than imagined. It measured just over 14 inches in length, narrowing at the base and swelling at the tip, in a way that defied medical categorization. The girth fluctuated dramatically, and there were ridges along the underside, likely fibrotic tissue from repeated trauma or intervention. It was not just malformed, it was mutilated, the scarring extended inward. There were signs of repeated self-incision, crude attempts at surgery performed without guidance or sterility. Some cuts had partially healed, others appeared fresher, as though Ferdinand had continued his mutilations into his final years. Sections of internal tissue were necrotic. Muscular fibers had atrophied. His urinary tract bore evidence of multiple infections. In one terrifying discovery, the examiners found fragments of ivory, remnants of a failed implantation, perhaps an attempt to brace or realign the curvature. These were not medical procedures. They were acts of desperation. The King of Spain, alone, at night, slicing into his own flesh in the hope of becoming a man the world could accept. No physician had been allowed to intervene fully. His pride, tangled with paranoia, had prevented honest treatment. He wanted miracles, not medicine, perfection, not prognosis, and so he took the burden upon himself to reshape what nature had mocked, and in doing so, to assert control over a body that had always betrayed him. The preserved organ, removed during the autopsy, was sealed in a jar of formalin and hidden in a Vatican vault. It remains there, according to unofficial records, alongside the anatomical anomalies of other cursed rulers and saints. The Church, faced with the political volatility of the truth, declared the material too dangerous for public knowledge. The physicians who participated signed confidentiality oaths backed by threats of excommunication and exile. The drawings they produced, detailed, clinical, disturbing, were catalogued under false names and buried in restricted archives. But the secrecy only amplified the grotesque poetry of it all. Ferdinand, a man who spent his life trying to erase his deformity from history, had instead enshrined it as his defining monument. His wives died bearing the weight of it. His kingdom collapsed under the rituals it required. His daughter, born of another man, was crowned beneath the shadow it cast, and in death, The thing he could not control became the one part of him the world would never forget. The tragedy was not in the deformity itself, but in what it revealed, the corrosive effect of unacknowledged shame given absolute power. Ferdinand's dysfunction was not confined to flesh. It infected policy, diplomacy, succession. He treated his wives as instruments, his ministers as spies, his people as obstacles to a private redemption that could never arrive. Every failed marriage became a state crisis. Every miscarriage, a reason to punish and purge. The national treasury funded devices of restraint instead of relief. Science bent to his insecurities. Religion twisted into permission. There was no part of Spain untouched by his pathology. And it was not only his story. Ferdinand was the inevitable product of a monarchy that equated blood with virtue, that isolated its rulers from reality and surrounded them with sycophants instead of truth. He inherited not only a throne but centuries of inbreeding, theological rigidity, and courtly cowardice. The crown that sat upon his head bore the weight of generations too terrified to name what they saw. His deformity was not just physical, it was political, systemic, dynastic. In the years that followed his death, historians struggled with how to remember him. His defenders pointed to stability, a weak claim, considering the revolutions erupting in every corner of the empire. His critics, more honest, saw in him a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with Spain. Its decline, its fear, its refusal to confront truth, even as it rotted the body politic from within. Ferdinand VII did not die a tyrant in the traditional sense. He died a man consumed by his own reflection, a man who mistook silence for loyalty, pain for duty, and delusion for destiny. His autopsy was not just a medical examination. It was a post-mortem on an era of governance driven by ego, denial, and dysfunction. The flesh revealed what the crown had concealed, and so he achieved immortality, not through greatness, not through empire, but through grotesquerie. His name became legend, not for triumph, but for torment. His preserved organ, hidden in the vaults of history, remains not a relic of royalty, but a warning that when shame is married to power, the consequences are not merely personal, they are national, generational, irreversible.